Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Today I want to talk about an argument made by English professor and literary biographer Michael Gora about why it's worth reading William Faulkner despite Faulkner's public statements full of racist assumptions, his portrayals of horrendous brutality in his novels, and also some complicated issues of cultural and linguistic appropriation. I'll be writing a complete review of Gora's book in the coming days, and I promise to share a link on this channel after that review is published, as well as possibly some of my thoughts about the biography. But today, I just want to talk about just one idea or question that Gora presents, and I'd love to hear what you think. As a white woman with deep Southern roots, white Southern liberal roots, and as an historian who studies extensively both the acts and the contexts of racism, I know I have a perspective that might be quite different from what other readers have, and I'd love to hear from some of y'all if any of you would be willing to share with me other ways of looking at these questions. If you're not somewhat familiar with the works of Faulkner, you might want to check out a video made last year by Brian at Bookish, where he talks about the issue of Faulkner's racism, his racism as a person and as an author, and really makes it clear how complex an issue it is. Today I want to talk a bit more broadly, just using Faulkner as an example rather than the actual subject. First, I want to say that talking about Southern literature, as if the term refers only to white authors, is not accurate. The same point, of course, applies when we use terms like Southern culture or even Southern heritage, a phrase often embraced by Southern white supremacists. In reality, Southern literature is what authors from that area of the country, be they black or white or mixed or anything else, wrote. Zora Neale Hurston and Alice Walker, Charles Chesnutt and Richard Wright have just as much claim to being Southern writers as do Faulkner and Thomas Wolfe and Eudora Welty and Flannery O'Connor. And so-called Southern heritage is what people of that region experienced, or what their ancestors experienced in the region. Yes, what it meant to be a white Southerner and what it meant to be a black Southerner were radically different. Still, the experiences of blacks and whites were linked in complicated ways. Fundamentally, Southern culture, as it affected both blacks and whites, was utterly saturated with political and economic hierarchical power structures based on race, and often upheld by violence. And honestly, racialized political and economic power structures are fundamental to American culture more broadly, too. Southern culture has long roots that go deep into the histories and cultural traditions of various communities in West Africa as well as Western Europe. They've intertwined over the years. White Southerners who are eating greens with a little pork and then sprinkled with hot pepper vinegar, alongside fried chicken and black-eyed peas and hush puppies, and reminiscing about their white grandmothers, are eating pretty much the same foods that black Southerners are eating when they're eating soul food. Many of these foods are traditions brought from West Africa by enslaved Africans, then adapted and grown in Southern soil, and often cooked by enslaved people for their white masters on plantations. We could follow the same basic idea of cultural admixture if we look at music or dance or whatever. And certainly it's true in literature as well, where a culture of storytelling was central throughout the South, and where historical experiences were shared even when seen with wildly divergent perspectives. I certainly don't mean to imply that everything was just one big happy family. It absolutely was not. But nevertheless, white Southern culture was not and is not completely separate or distinct from a lot of black Southern culture. My father said it much more eloquently than I can in his book, Shared Traditions. Southern folk culture, quote, is the dynamic product of rich and complex interactions by the descendants of Europeans and Africans with one another and with Native Americans. Because of these interactions, every Southerner, regardless of race, shares both African and European traditions. Out of the cultural triangle of Europe, Africa, and the American South has emerged a profound and creative exchange that has given the region a distinctive folk culture of great strength and great beauty, a folk culture that unites all the South's people, perhaps in deeper ways than we even yet understand. All of that is kind of a tangent. Today I want to talk specifically about white Southern writers in the 20th century and how they wrote about race. Faulkner was a man who, as the author Michael Gora writes, used racial epithets almost every day of his life, and at least mostly accepted the whole social order of the Jim Crow South. Nevertheless, Gora argues when Faulkner was writing, quote, something happened when he faced a fictional page. The pen made him honest. It isn't that Faulkner didn't write racist prose. He certainly did. But nevertheless, at some level, his desire to portray the society around him led him to a certain kind of understanding, or maybe even empathy, for the black characters he created. Gora argues that Faulkner's major black characters were, quote, as clearly individuated as his white ones. There are times when Faulkner's attempts to create African American characters led him to make choices that we might question now. Faulkner imagines what they might say when there are no white people around to hear, Gora points out, and at times his use of dialect seems egregiously stereotypical. But then Gora points out that almost all Southern writers of the period, both black and white, use similar linguistic conventions, including Zora Neale Hurston and Richard Wright, and that interestingly, Faulkner's black Northern characters tended to speak like white Northerners, and that his white Southern characters also used word choice and phrasing that were distinctly Southern, although rarely presented phonetically as black speech usually was. White Northern characters say that white Southerners sound, quote, colored. Gora argues that the use of dialect, even if it was done out of respect, violates our contemporary standards of what is acceptable for publication. By what right, he asks, does Faulkner attempt to represent or speak for the other or through the other? Isn't that obviously a form of cultural and linguistic appropriation, having white authors create black characters and then create dialogue for them? If Faulkner did not include his version of the voices and perspectives of black characters, or didn't include these characters at all, the author would have been creating a version of Southern culture that was completely implausible. Gora points out that Faulkner would have made this argument for why this kind of ventriloquism was necessary. It was a condition of realism. Gora takes the argument much further, that Faulkner could not have depicted the power relationships in the society as fully as he eventually did without employing black characters. Showing the intensity of brutality, for example, would be hard if Faulkner never tried to imagine how a black character would understand the Southern system. This is a really interesting point if we take it to extremes. If authors who are racially identified with the people in power only write about other people racially identified as the people in power, those authors would be writing about a completely segregated society, more segregated, as Gora writes, than Jim Crow ideology ever succeeded at. Let me read what Gora says. Such a writer might have the best of intentions in his reluctance to seem as though he were speaking for others. Nevertheless, his work would present a vision of society as an all-white fantasy, indeed a white supremacist dream. Gora isn't at all letting Faulkner off the hook. He shows that what's problematic, to use the word of the day, is more related to the use of stereotypical assumptions and prejudices than the novelists use when they paint their characters. Do they, as Gora says, erect a hierarchy of representation that replicates the social world around them? If so, the characterizations might be racist failures. But in the better cases, these characters might be a starting point for both the author and the reader to recognize the reality of racist brutality, and also the reality that people discriminated against have their own lives to make, as Gora says, their own world and ambitions. And that, in this case, Faulkner realizes his white characters never appreciated or even really imagined that independent life. Gora argues that this approach, which is, as I said, just a starting place, is an approach that required Faulkner to develop a degree of empathy and understanding that critics often point out comes through more in his novels than it did in his public life, and more in his later novels than his earlier books. Our current discomfort with reading works by racist authors, or misogynist authors, as I've mentioned recently, or homophobic or anti-trans authors, is a discomfort that shows our commitment to justice. That's very clear to me. Choosing not to buy these books and finance the careers of living authors who you think perpetuate cruelty, either in their books or in their public speech, seems very reasonable to me. But I still have some reservations. Yes, we absolutely need to recruit and publish and read more literature by authors of color and women, which is less of an issue now, but certainly has been historically, and immigrants and people living on poverty and other voices we don't hear enough in the publishing world. But we also still need to hear from white authors trying to grapple with the impacts of inequality too. Understanding how injustice and brutality shapes people at the top of the power structure is important, how it benefits them, even as it also limits their own lives, as well as the lives of those around them. Understanding how people who think of themselves as good and thoughtful people, but can nevertheless do such violence, symbolically, but also literally, is something we need to read and consider as we try to figure out how to move forward. When authors do this kind of grappling, as I think Faulkner was doing, at least to some degree, it can help us understand how we ourselves might be acting with injustice towards others, even while we think we are being good and moral people. The amazing thing to me is how much fiction can help us open our eyes. Well, thanks for listening. I'd love to know what you think about these issues. Would you read William Faulkner at this point? And if not, would it be specifically because of his racism? What do you think is the appropriate way to deal with the fact that authors who lived through different contexts create books that don't necessarily fit with our modern contexts? And to take it one step further, are there ideas and assumptions in our culture that you predict will be understood as unjust or unfair when future generations look back on us? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.